So much for the Tories in Europe. What about Labour? Ed Miliband's party is currently riding high in the polls, and at the moment, it's the bookies' favourite to win an overall majority in 2015. In a speech last week, Shadow Foreign Secretary Douglas Alexander gave us some clues about Labour's attitude to Europe. Labour, he says, does not believe in holding an in-out referendum, now or in the future. But he doesn't want to imply this means his party supports the status quo. He says Labour wants a reformed and flexible Europe that can accommodate varying levels of integration among member states. This, he insists, is not the same as an à la carte Europe, where each country can pick which bits they wish to sign up to. His party, he says, wants to see big reforms in the common agricultural policy. Though it has to be said, they've tried that one before. And he says the kind of immigration we saw after the last wave of countries from Eastern Europe joined up should not be allowed to happen again, though he doesn't explain how. And Douglas Alexander joins me now for the Sunday interview. Douglas Alexander, you heard it there from Liam Fox. He's happy with the speech. It will propose a major repatriation of powers. There'll be a referendum eventually when he does this, if all predicated on the next election, of course. And we'll be given a choice of vote for this more semi-detached relationship or, in essence, vote to leave. Which side will you vote on?
Well, I'm working hard to make sure David Cameron doesn't offer that choice because he isn't the Prime Minister after the elections in 2015.
But supposing he is.
But the very fact that this is now being negotiated with Liam Fox, with the greatest respect to a former Cabinet Minister, tells you everything you need to know about this speech. It's got more to do with the politics of the Conservative Party. It's a very fair question asking him whether he wanted back into the Cabinet than actually to do with the national interest. Why has this speech been delayed for more than a year? David Cameron, I would suggest, was actually rendered speechless because of the gap between what his backbenchers will tolerate and what European partners will willingly give him.
Right, but Mr. Alexander, what I asked you was, supposing the bookies are wrong, Mr. Cameron forms an overall majority administration, he negotiates, he repatriates, he goes to the people and say, either vote for this more semi-detached relationship or a no vote is out. Which side will you be on?
I'm very clear. I want Britain to stay in the European Union.
So you'll campaign yes too?
Well, I want to see Britain as part of the European Union, but I'm not convinced that the strategy that David Cameron is setting out is actually the right strategy for Britain.
You say that rather than repatriating powers, Labour would lead the case for reform across the whole of the EU. Now, you were in power for 13 years. What major EU reforms did you successfully spearhead?
Well, if you want to look at some of the discussions we're having just now, whether it's justice and home affairs, the right to that opt-out in 2014 the government is talking about was secured by the last Labour government.
That's an opt-out. What major reform of the EU did you achieve?
Well, working with other European partners, we saw the extension of the European Union, taking in 10 former Soviet Union
countries. That had been Margaret
countries.
Thatcher's policy. What reforms did you achieve?
But frankly, if you look at the success that was achieved from accession moving forward, I think the Labour government deserves some credit for that. We lowered the proportion of spending on agriculture spent by the European budget quite significantly. Yes, and we want to see it go further, but it did continue to fall. It had been as high as, if I recollect, about 70% in the 1980s. It's now down just above 30%. Wow.
You say you want fundamental reform of the CAP. You said that in your speech. Yeah. All British governments have wanted that since the common market was founded.
Progress has been made.
Well, yeah, but you really didn't get fundamental reform. You cut the amount of spending and it's still the single biggest item. It wasn't much progress,
well, it's fallen, as I say, from approximately 70% in the mid-80s to a position now where it's just about 30% of European expenditure.
But let me just show you what the French agriculture minister has said. This is what he says. President Hollande and I are totally committed to securing a strong CAP budget for EU agriculture. You haven't got a hope at all of reforming this, have you?
So your point is if one country says something, that doesn't guarantee the other 26
will agree.
My point
is that the French
that's the point I'm making about reform. That's my point about
since the
Cameron's speech. The truth is you can have one minister insist on something. The way to achieve reform is to build a consensus for change. And that's the fundamental...
And you've never done that?
Well, no, that's the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of a suggestion that simply by standing at the exit door threatening to leave, Britain is necessarily going to prevail.
Well, the last time a Labour government promised to reform the CAP, Tony Blair gave away a big chunk of Britain's rebate as part of the deal. And then nothing very much happened. No. You were the Europe Minister.
To be perfectly honest, that was not anything to do with the CP. It had everything to do with accession. The fact that that multi-annual financial framework, as it's called, was agreed reflected the fact that there were 10 new members of the European Union. Of course, the European budget was going to change in those circumstances. And incidentally, given you're quoting French ministers, Tony Blair secured for the first time broad parity in the contribution to the European Union between France and the United Kingdom, something that even Margaret Thatcher hadn't achieved during her years in power.
You say that Labour would lead the case for pro-growth, anti-austerity economic policies, building alliances with your European partners rather than making enemies, as you say, Mr Cameron. Which partners currently in power do you have for this venture on side?
Well, I think if you look at what happened in December 2011 when David Cameron walked out of the European Council, just a few months later we saw François Hollande secure additional growth compacts alongside the fiscal compact that David Cameron walked away from.
He's just introduced, in his own words, the most austere budget for France in 30 years.
Yes, nobody's arguing that there don't need to be changes in terms of the European budget.
But you said you would lead the case for anti-austerity economic policies.
But the balance between austerity and growth needs to be the right one. That's the same argument we're having here in the United Kingdom.
You're saying that a president who's introduced the most austere budget in 30 years is one of your partners in leading the case for anti-austerity policies?
He recognises the need for growth policies in Europe, and alas, David Cameron. Well, the person who's not credible, alas, is David Cameron, who talks in his speech from the extracts we've seen about the difficulty of austerity being imposed in Europe, when I'm afraid that's exactly what George Osborne are doing here in the United Kingdom.
Why are you so against repatriating powers on a major scale? I mean, a poll out this morning shows that it's the will of the people. Look at this. Is David Cameron right to do so? 59% think he's right to try and do it. 21% are opposed. 58% think this is the time to do it. Only 28% don't.
Well, we'll consider on a case-by-case basis the merits or demerits of where those powers lie, but we think that it is disingenuous to suggest that it is inevitable or indeed likely that if David Cameron goes with a very long shopping list and demands these powers to come back, even in circumstances where we're not sure whether there's going to be fundamental treaty change, that he's likely to prevail. And he risks being trapped by his own rhetoric and his own backbenchers.
Are the people wrong to want a major repatriation of powers?
Of course we recognise the concerns of the people.
But are they right or are they wrong?
Well, I think the biggest deficit in Europe at the moment, in terms of the balance between democratic change and change in policy, is a delivery deficit. They want to see a European Union contributing to a changed kind of economy, but they also want to see other changes. We want to see those changes in the Labour Party. And that's why in the speech that I gave, I said we don't support the status quo. We want to see Britain as part of Europe, but we want to see change in Europe.
Let's clear up Labour's position on referendum and on the existing law which this coalition introduced, which guarantees a referendum in the event of any further transfer of powers from Westminster to Brussels. Now, you told me on the Daily Politics, quote, you have no plans to repeal it. I'd suggest these are kind of weasel words politicians use. Will you today promise to leave that law intact for the lifetime of the next Parliament?
Well, we intend to leave that law intact. Ed Miliband said as much on the Today programme on Thursday morning. So we're not planning to change that law. But obviously, as a new piece of legislation, we'll keep it under review.
But will there be a commitment in the next Labour manifesto not to repeal the referendum law?
It won't surprise you. I'm not going to write the referendum even on your programme, Andrew, but we are not planning on changing the referendum law that was established in this Parliament.
Will you, in the next manifesto, promise, will you privatise the NHS?
We're not planning on privatising the NHS either.
Right, so you can answer that. So can you tell me, will there be a Labour manifesto commitment not to repeal the referendum law?
We will deal with this issue, as with all other issues, at the time of the manifesto. But Ed Miliband said very clearly on Thursday morning, we are not planning to change the referendum law that was established in this Parliament.
Will you promise that if there's a transfer of powers agreed from Brussels, under Labour, to Brussels, if that was to happen.
I'm sorry, from Brussels to Brussels.
If there was a transfer of powers from London to Brussels under a Labour government, that you'd put that to the people as laid down in the legislation?
Well, that is established in the legislation.
Would you do so?
Well, let me answer your question. It would need to meet the threshold established by the law that's on the statute books. But if it meets the statute threshold, then of course, yes, it would be put to the people in a referendum.
See, the reason people expect you to be categorical, or more so, is that you voted against the referendum legislation.
At the second reading, yes.
Yeah, you voted against the law.
Yes,
they don't trust you. They think
Well, let me explain to you why. We had very real concerns, and these were shared by those well-known Europhiles like Bill Cash, incidentally, that this would create concerns about the level of judicial review we would see over European policy. That's why the sensible approach, it seemed to me, was to say we should raise these doubts at second reading and then see how the bill operates. We didn't, incidentally, vote against the legislation at third reading. There wasn't a division in the Commons.
Are you prepared to rule out any kind of in-out referendum?
I don't think that's the right choice for Britain now, and I don't think to announce now a referendum years ahead on negotiations that haven't yet begun makes sense.
So can you say that under a Labour government, bar what we were talking about, a possible vote on a transfer of power, more power to Brussels, that there will be, bar that, no referendum?
Well, we don't believe it's right to now announce a referendum for years into the next Parliament, as I understand is what is being contemplated by David Cameron this week.
So there will be no in-out, but can you be explicit? Will there be no in-out referendum under a Labour government?
Well, we don't think that's a choice that could or should be made now. We do believe it's the wrong choice for Britain to commit to up to 7 years of economic instability with investment under threat, as we expect the Prime Minister will announce this week. But it is rarely wise in international relations to ever say never. And in that sense, we'll need to see the changing shape of Europe in the years ahead. But as we can anticipate the changing shape of Europe today, we don't think it's the right choice.
Let me ask you about the developing situation in Algeria, just to finish up with Mr. Alexander. Do you agree that parts of North Africa, known as the Sahel, that part that goes from the Atlantic coast through to the Red Sea, are now the cockpit of Al-Qaeda terrorism? And if you do, what should Britain do about it?
I agree that the Sahel and North Africa more generally is a growing threat because it represents ungoverned space. In northern Mali alone, we're talking about a size of country twice the size of Germany, effectively now under the control of violent extremists. But I don't think it serves the interests of Britain or of the world to see this as a blanket war on terror. I think that language and that frame was actually harmful rather than beneficial in recent years. And in that sense, I think we need to recognise this as a regional threat that demands a regional response. I would like to see an African-led response to the challenges in Mali and to the region.
But we've been waiting for an African-led response for over 6 months.
Yes, and there are Nigerian troops, as I understand it, arriving in Mali in the coming days.
They
were due to arrive in September, which is why the French acted. They've got more than 6,000
because they didn't
French
turn up.
nationals. Well, they've got more than 6,000 French nationals in Mali, but it adds urgency both to the military and diplomatic response to this problem.
It's fine for you to say a regional thing, but let's just get the reality here. There's supposed to be 5,500 West African troops going to Mali. So far, fewer than 100 have arrived. At the meeting, they decided they couldn't afford the military transport to send them. And I would also point out, none of these troops has any desert training.
And I wouldn't dispute any of those points. I would dispute that the right response, therefore, is to put British boots on the ground. I think we need to recognise, first of all, that many of these insurgencies have roots that go back decades, if not centuries. And secondly, have we not learned that the truth is the way to respond to an insurgency may involve a military component by those regional forces, but requires a political, diplomatic and development effort as well?
And so far, as far as we're concerned, or you're concerned, the French are on their own.
No, the British government have provided 2 C-17 aircraft. We supported that in the Commons. But I think there's a difference between that kind of logistical support and being in a position where an immediate response today leads to longer-term challenges in the future. Frankly, I think now is a time for cool heads and caution in relation to the emerging threat in North Africa.
Douglas Alexander, thank you for being on the Sunday Politics.